All right, hello everybody. Let's get started here. I'm Gabriel Metcalf, the CEO of the Committee for Sydney, and thank you for joining today's edition of Committee for Sydney Live, where our topic is How are cities working on a resilient recovery? Featuring Lauren Sorkin, the Acting Executive Director of the Global Resilient Cities Network. Committee for Sydney members will know that we have been deeply interested in the topic of resiliency and exploring some of its many facets. One thing that has really struck me about the moment we're in is that some of the people who really saw COVID coming, in the sense of warning the world that pandemics were increasingly likely, were probably an inevitability. Some of the people who really saw that were the leaders of the resiliency movement. They are now some of the people doing the deepest thinking about what we do to manage COVID and hopefully come out of it in better shape. And a theme we've been exploring through these is this: what does this idea of building back better mean? Because we don't want to just go back to the old normal. We want the new normal to be better than the old normal. So again, people in the resiliency movement are doing a lot of the thinking about that. You could say this is a moment that they were made for. So we're very excited to have Lauren taking time with us today, joining us from Singapore. As Global Resilient Cities Network Executive Director, Lauren works to empower cities to respond to all kinds of shocks and stresses and help cities learn from one another. She leads a team of urban resilience professionals in London, Mexico City, New York, and Singapore, in collaboration with chief resilience officers in 40 countries. Her work grows out of the 100 Resilient Cities program, which many of you will be familiar with, but it is a new organization with a new approach, and I'm sure she'll explain all of that. Her resume is incredible. It includes stints at the Asian Development Bank and USAID, in addition to other things. I won't go through all of that. The format today is Lauren will make some opening remarks, and then we will take questions and discussion, which you can submit via the Q&A app on Zoom. With that, Lauren, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Gabriel, and thanks for having me on this webinar today, and thanks for everyone for making the time to join. I know that there are lots of ways to spend this time at home. Many of them are virtual meetings like this, and so I really appreciate it. I'm going to be speaking for a little bit about urban resilience, about how Global Resilient Cities Network addresses urban resilience, a little bit about what we've learned through COVID-19 with cities, and then I want to leave plenty of time for discussion with all of you. Committee for Sydney was kind enough to share with me the registration list, so I know that for many of you, the discussion about urban resilience is not a new one, and many of you have been following this issue and really contributing to this issue quite a bit. So I'd rather save some time for us to talk in more detail about what is on your minds and how the knowledge that we're accumulating as a network can be of more service to Sydney, because that's really our role. So with that, I'm going to share my screen because I have some slides that describe the work that we're doing. And we'll go from there. So hopefully that is coming up. Let me put it into presentation mode. Okay, is that coming through clearly?
Perfect.
James, if you can give me a high
Perfectly.
sign. Okay, great. All right, so just to start out, it's important to contextualize what we mean by urban resilience. So in this context, we look at urban resilience with a definition that I always like to describe as both bold and broad. And it's important to recognize that we're looking at how cities including from top to bottom, right? From institutions, businesses, citizens to individuals, can respond to any kind of shock and stress. And that this work that we do responds to physical, social, and economic challenges. We are a very global organization, and we work across 6 continents, 21 languages, and 47 countries. As Gabriel mentioned, the former project that ended last year was 100 Resilient Cities. And Global Resilient Cities Network's work builds on the foundation of that work and includes all of the member cities, which you see pictured here on the map, who were members of the 100 Resilient program, their chief resilience officers, offices, and strategies. And I'll talk more about that. But this is a fundamentally different approach because we are city-led. So we work with our membership to determine priorities. We work with partners to deliver programs on the ground, and we're impact focused. So we're really looking at moving those 5 years that the Rockefeller program worked on building capacity to projects and implementation. So going back to resilience. Resilience is that capacity of individuals, communities, institutions, businesses, and systems to survive, adapt, and grow, no matter what kinds of shocks and stresses they experience. And the reason this is important to contextualize as we talk about all of this is because this is not a new definition. In fact, this is a definition that we've been talking about for more than 6 years. And as you see, this is not a slide that I prepared just for this presentation, but disease outbreaks and the interplay with climate change, poverty, and systemic racism. These are issues that we've been talking about. So one of the things that I've been saying increasingly in these forums over the past few months is that we really knew that something like this could happen. And in many ways, we should have been better prepared. So how do we work, and a little bit more about the network of cities that I'm going to be drawing examples from. So we build on the legacy of the Rockefeller Foundation 100 Resilient Cities program. This program invested in people and plans. And this is extremely important because in terms of urban resilience, you are as strong as, going back to the definition, as your capacity to survive, adapt, and grow. Your capacity is intimately linked, inextricably linked to the people and the plans that you have. You always hear the old adage, trust in your training. When bad things happen, trust your training. If you don't have the training, you don't have the people, you don't have the plan, when bad things happen, it is not a good situation. So for 6 years, we spent time investing in the people, chief resilience officers. And chief resilience officers the world over have a similar profile, and they had a similar training with the 100 Resilient Cities program. So in every city that we work in, this person is a top level advisor, a senior person that reports directly to city mayors or city leaders, depending on the governance context. And this CRO must have the power to convene across the city. We often call our chief resilience officers silo busters. It's one of their superpowers, their ability to work across sectors, across departments, across divisions within government. That's what CROs do. And all of those CROs have worked with us over a year or 2, and sometimes 3 or 4 years to develop and implement a resilience strategy. That is the planning part. And that is a plan that looks at that holistic list of shocks and stresses, identifies opportunities, and then specific actions that cities need to take. Over the course of 6 years, we developed many strategies, in fact, more than 80 strategies in our cities, and we still have more than 80 acting CROs that work with us. Of those, most of the cities have taken on payment for the chief resilience officers, which really shows a commitment to this work and to continuing to building resilience. Now, what's also important as we talk about this and why it's important to learn between networks is that our cities actually have a tremendous amount in common, both in terms of common shocks as well as common stresses. Even though you have cities who are as small as the city of Vile in Denmark with 40,000 people, and cities like Jakarta and Mexico City who have upwards of 20 million in their metro areas, the issues that cities are facing at the local level are strikingly similar. And we like to look at our cities in different areas in terms of who are our coping champions, where there are proven experiences to respond to these shocks and stresses, proving grounds, places where cities are willing to try new things, and highly vulnerable cities, which are trying to address issues and need a lot of assistance. And one thing I'd like to stress in this area, and we've seen this play out with COVID-19, is just because a city is a coping champion around one shock or stress does not necessarily mean that they are not highly vulnerable in another way. So the power in the network is the ability to look at what are these key shocks. So in this case, extreme heat, rainfall, flooding, disease outbreak, and overlay them with common stresses like inequality and look for solutions that are scalable. And that really leads to how we work. I'm going to move pretty quickly about this because this is more about our organization, and I want to get to some of the city learnings and some of the specific cases that we've seen get a lot of attention and traction during COVID times in this context. So our mission is to empower, implement, mobilize, and amplify. And in terms of that, we focus on city to city and city to partner programs. We also have a resilient community investment fund that our cities can apply to leverage funds for innovative projects. And then we focus a lot on amplification. So events like this, events with other cities where we take good practice and we share it with the world. So very quickly, in terms of cities on the front line and cities for a resilient recovery, our response to COVID-19 started way back at the end of January. We have a city in our network that is located less than 70 kilometers from the city of Wuhan. The city is called Guangzhou. You've probably never heard of it, but it's a city of 4 million people in China. Now, the Chief Resilience Officer and I, instead of exchanging our usual Chinese New Year pleasantries, because I'm based in Singapore, we also celebrate Chinese New Year, we were talking about COVID-19. The city of Wuhan was already in lockdown. The Chief Resilience Officer and his team had gone home for the holiday and had been told that they couldn't leave their homes. Many of them left without laptops, without anything from their offices, and they were already in lockdown, and they were reaching out to us to understand what was going on outside and could our network help them to access learnings and also to access protective equipment. And it was at that moment in late January that we knew we really needed to spring into action because there was such a diversity of information about what COVID-19 was, how cities should respond. But one thing was very clear, and that was that cities were on the front line. As densely populated urban centers, they were the most vulnerable. And we have seen this. The UN Habitat put out a report, now it's about 2 months ago, showing the difference between cases in urban and rural areas. Many of you probably will have seen it. But upwards of 70% of cases are in urban areas. And in many countries, it's even higher than that. So at a very early stage, we created a channel for cities to collaborate with one another and with experts around COVID-19 and get information about the disease and get information about how other cities were responding. So we established a real-time global chat groups for our city members to ask each other questions in confidence. We established a weekly speaker series called Cities on the Front Line that we convene with the World Bank. It's still ongoing. There's an episode tonight. If any of you are interested, it's about digital technology. But the archive is also online so that cities can go on and find the issues that they're interested in, get to best practice, reach out across the network to their counterparts, and then enact policies. Because the disease was moving so fast, response and recovery needed to move just as fast. Now, the next part of the work that we're doing is we were actually activating cohorts of cities around specific resilient recovery issues, because we have to build back better. Going back to the beginning of the presentation and what I said, a lot of these issues we knew were there. And what COVID-19 has done is it has blown open any vulnerability that a city had. And so the need to build back better is even more urgent than before. I'm going to go very quickly along two other program areas that we have. We also work very specifically on project preparation. In this case, we're working on projects in Africa around water system resilience. Whenever we're working on projects, we are taking a systemic approach. This program happens to focus on African cities that are being supported by the German Ministry for Economic Cooperation, ourselves, ARAP and WRI. And this will help cities to develop projects that will enable them to have more resilience in their water systems over the next decade. We're also working with cities in this region, in the Asia Pacific region, around circular economy and the prevention of plastic leakage into oceans. This program, like most of our programs, and I want to highlight this here, relies on project preparation, tools for resilience planning, and also mentoring between cities who are coping champions, in this case, who have very advanced waste management techniques, and cities who are trying to move quickly towards those approaches. I'm going to skip this one and this one for now. I want to go to learning from the network around COVID-19. So this is a slide that I borrow from the city of Belfast. Now, one of the great things about the network is that it can meet you wherever you are. And the reason I show this is because it is a very simple and elegant way that the city of Belfast has organized their recovery conversation. What they did, very simply, was to say, what are we doing in this crisis? What have we started that we want to keep going? We want to enshrine it as a new practice. What did we start just because we had to respond, but we actually want to stop them because they're specific to the crisis? What did we stop that in fact we should have stopped a long time ago? And there are countless examples of this that we've heard from our cities, whether it's pedestrianizing main streets, moving council meetings online so that it's easier for more members of the community to participate. So what are the things that we want to let go? We don't want to have those closed meetings anymore. We don't want to have those closed streets that are reserved for cars anymore. And then what are the things that we're missing out on? What do we want to restart? And the reason I share this is because in its simplicity, in its elegance, it's an example of how the city has started to plan for that new normal, even in the midst of crisis. And that is one of the key benefits of the network approach and also the holistic resilience approach, is that you have to learn while you're doing, not waiting until you get to the end of the process and then reflecting back, but holding your plan, holding on to the learning while you're going through the process. Now, I want to spend a couple of minutes talking about what the network is learning from the city of Sydney. And there are many things that the network has learned from Sydney, but in this case, I want to focus on three things. One is around leadership and communication about resilience. The second is around partnership, and I think that this group is a very good example of that and the interest in this topic. And the last is really about sharing learning, and that will be about urban heat. So first of all, on clear urban resilience, leadership, and communication. I think one of the things that Sydney faces, that many cities face, is multiple levels of governance. Now, when we came into working in the Australian context, this was something that we had a lot of conversations about, because creating a resilience strategy at a city scale did not really make sense unless we could have a conversation at a metropolitan scale. And I think that this is something that the network has learned a lot from Sydney, is to see what does it look like to really have a whole of city approach, to bring all the councils into the conversation and have them be heard and have that be a truly cross-dimensional, cross-temporal, and geographic conversation that makes sense in the context of the challenges that the city was facing. And I think that that was due to really fantastic leadership, you know, from Mayor Clover Moore, from Beck Dawson, CRO, and also from Monica Baroni, the CEO of the City of Sydney, not saying this is our process, but being very generous, inclusive, and advocating for this to be really a citywide process, and bringing folks in. And that is something that is invaluable. As we're seeing now, viruses don't respect borders, not of councils, not of cities, and not of countries. So we have to have the conversation at a meaningful level, and that communication, that leadership, and that advocacy has to start from the top. I also have to say this is one of my favorite photos because in more than 5 years working in the Asia Pacific region, when we launched the strategy in the City of Sydney, it was the first time that I had stood together with a female mayor and a female CRO as the female director of the region at that time. So this is a very special photo for me. The second thing that I think the network learns very well from Sydney is about partnership. And so this has been very evident in work with this group and work with the Red Cross and others, is that in the creation of the resilience strategy and in the initiatives, partnerships were front and center. Resilience is such a broad umbrella that in order to actually target these issues, you have to build up from where you are, you have to acknowledge the issues, and you also have to acknowledge the leadership. And there are a lot of wonderful partners to work with in Sydney, and I think that the team has done an incredible job of engaging those groups and moving work forward, being additive and being inclusive. And then finally on urban heat. So we have created, as one of the communities coming out of the resilience recovery work, a group on urban heat, and Sydney's work has been world leading. So one of the things that Sydney has offered back to the network is to share those practices, to do webinars, to follow up, to share resources with other cities in the network. So just a few of the statistics that we have seen in terms of cities on the front line, and the link to the full site, which has all of our resources, is there in the white. We have already seen that having CROs in place, and this is where I want to bring the presentation to an end, having CROs in place, having plans in place, has put cities in a much better position to respond to this crisis. And 89% of our network CROs are being tapped by their cities, either to lead in relief, response, and recovery, or one of those aspects. Very small numbers of our CROs were focused on a single issue, but nevertheless, we did see that there were some focus areas around testing, food supply, equitable approaches, business, and economics. And the majority of CROs, which I think is a very exciting piece because the real work is about building back better, is that the majority of the CROs, the leaders in our network, are being tasked with what a resilient recovery looks like. So that's where I want to leave it on that note of opportunity. Gabriel, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'm going to turn it back to you to lead us through the Q&A.
Okay, thanks so much, Lauren. Really interesting. I've got all kinds of great questions, which you can submit via the Q&A app. I also have some that have come in via text, so I will combine these and sort through them and ask Lauren. So first, Lauren, let me just ask you a question about kind of resilience as a lens on things. Some of the problems you are taking on have been around for a long time. Poverty, inequality, certainly as long as capitalism, they have been around and people have been trying to do something about them, probably longer, I guess longer, thousands of years. What does a resilience lens on problems like that bring that is distinctive?
So I think the answer is a little bit in the question. The resilience lens is by nature holistic. So we're not looking at people as statistics. We're actually looking at what it is that is the root cause of poverty in a specific location, right? Poverty is a rather blunt instrument or a blunt term in some ways. Because if you look at what would be the poverty line, it's pretty absurd, right? To say that someone should be surviving on $2 a day and the purchasing power that that has across different contexts is not substantial. So to say that people are going to be poor or not poor based on that line isn't significant unless you understand their context, unless you understand the causality. And actually, in the Sydney context, I remember when the strategy was ongoing, Beck was working on a survey with one of the university partners, and I can't remember which one. I think she's on the call, so she can probably give more insight to this. But this is characteristic of the, I think, excellent work that you can do with the resilience lens. She was looking at the timing of people falling into poverty. And there was a very strong correlation with when people had to pay school fees and people being very stretched in the context. And so taking a root cause and an interlinked approach at looking at the causes of poverty, and that enables you to design solutions that are fit for purpose and that are not, as we're seeing in many places, just repeated handouts, right? And so you need recovery payments in the beginning, right? Because you need to get people through difficult times. But to create sustainable solutions for poverty, you actually have to understand what were the root causes, what are the changes there. So I think the lens approach, looking at root causes and the interdependencies of a community that is poor in an urban context, that's what a holistic urban resilience lens offers to this discussion.
Great. Let's talk about COVID. The City of Sydney's resilience plan raised the likelihood of diseases led by Beck Dawson, as did, I assume, most of the resilience plans that would have come through the network, because people were sharing that information with each other. So they saw it coming. But it's not actually that satisfying to say I told you so. So I'm sure they're all thinking about how to prevent the next one. What wisdom can you offer about what we collectively should be doing to keep this from being such a recurring problem?
We have to learn from this this disease in terms of using it as a focusing mechanism. I mean, as you rightly said, this is not a new potential shock, right? Disease outbreak, as you saw from the slides, and as I mentioned, is something that we've flagged for a long time. In going forward, you have to look at what the cracks were in the system, right? What was the limiting factor, right? In some places, it's water and sanitation, which is why I highlighted that program for our African cities. For those communities, having places to wash hands, having places to use sanitation facilities that are secure without huge risk of contagion is significant. Now, that is not the plan for Sydney, right? So for Sydney and other cities like Singapore, there's a big conversation about how we rethink public space, how we rethink our central business districts, how we rethink transportation, and how we rethink tourism. So what you have to do is that you have to look at your opportunities, what you were trying to advance in your plans before and your goals, and what cracks in those plans COVID revealed. And that's where you have to draw your attention, right, to that interplay. And in order to support that, we've actually created a Resilient Cities toolkit for resilient recovery, which we just launched last week. And that set of tools, which is available on that website that I pointed out in white, that set of tools allows cities, private sector, others, not to start with a blank sheet of paper, but to have a framework for looking at how to plan better in that context.
Got a question about extreme heat. As you may know, Penrith in Western Sydney routinely has a few days each year where it is the hottest place on the earth. Um, it's Western Sydney is where a lot of population growth is going. When temperatures are 50 degrees, it's far beyond the ability of things like tree canopy to cool sufficiently. What do we do to deal with the problem of extreme heat in those conditions?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, Gabriel. And if Beck is on, I would love her to give more insight into the Sydney specific examples as well. I don't know if you're able to call on her, but I would say that we had a presentation on extreme heat and COVID-19 in our speaker series just about a month ago. And we looked at the case of New York, and we also looked at the case of The Hague. And as you said, the extreme temperatures, upwards of 45, 50 degrees, that's not going to be something that you can deal with just with tree canopy. You will have to identify your vulnerable communities, right? Because heat does not affect everyone equally. So one of the things that the researchers from Columbia University pointed out in that webinar was that you actually can do a tremendous amount with your existing data about population age and historical temperatures. And you can find those hotspots, and then you can plan either for safe cooling centers. And there are a number now of new technologies that filter, I mean, they're not new technologies actually, it's more integrating existing air filtration technologies in these cooling centers so that they're ensuring that they're not building up virus load in the air conditioning units. You have to identify where those are going to go, where you're going to prioritize those areas. And there are still a lot of lower cost ways to address this in neighborhoods. And one of the other things that was stressed, both by The Hague as well as by the team from Columbia, is that partnership between real estate developers and the city. So having that conversation about those high risk areas and saying, what can we do to make the assets that maybe you're not using fully, especially in a COVID time, available, turn on the aircon for those populations, or using the rooftops of buildings to say, drape canopies between buildings so that people can still walk safely in neighborhoods when it's very hot and not get extreme sun exposure. So there are some of these really, really easy fixes, but they require good mapping and data of where your vulnerabilities are, and then very good cooperation between your real estate development community, right? Your property owners or your property managers, and also your city.
Okay, great. Let me ask a question that comes in from one of the Sydney elected council members. I love the point about learn as you go. Here's an example, pop-up cycleways, and how this new process can potentially cause division among the community, meaning a bunch of the local residents were really unhappy they went in. What are some of the best community engagement processes or platforms or advice you might have about how to bring the community with you when you want to work quickly? So attention noticed many, many times in the cities of the world between wanting to have an agile process where you can test and iterate and try things out and not take 10 years to do things, but wanting to be democratic about it and engage with the community deeply. How do you resolve that?
Yeah, I think that those are great questions, and it's certainly something we're seeing across many of our cities is this tension, right, between that quick evolution and wanting to take advantage of the moment to advance policies and community members that you need to get on board. And you know, we've seen a number of fantastic online tools developed. I mean, it's hard to advocate for just one. We in the past worked in the U.S. and maybe Gabriel, you're familiar with the Neighborland applications for sourcing ideas. I think it helps when you don't start with the solution and you start with the question. And you know, that's something that we focus quite a lot on in resilience planning, right? Is what is the value that you're trying to create in the community, and involving the community in the question first. And that can be done with a lot of time. It can be done in a shorter amount of time, especially with online tools. So I think it's very much about how you pace that conversation to say, look, we want to create safer, healthier transportation in our community. This is the value we're trying to create. What are your ideas? And then that, and this is not rocket science. I'm probably not telling your council member anything that she doesn't already know, but actually having that authority to say, that we've asked, and that, the majority of your community members have spoken before going to the solution.
A couple questions have come in about your comment about multiple tiers of governance, which almost every country has multiple tiers of governance. Maybe not Singapore, but most places do. As you would probably know, in Australia, power is quite centralized in the states, much more than in the United States. And in a way that is really fascinating to people from a country like the UK. So quite different to that. Do you have any examples where you're seeing a rethink about how the different levels of government work together as a result of COVID, or even potentially sort of structural changes?
So the answer to the first question is certainly. We've seen so much movement in the conversations about governance. I mean, in our home country, Gabriel, in the US, it's been very interesting to see some states where cities, mayors and governors have worked really well together, like the example of New York. And then you've seen other cities and states where a governor has overturned a request for mask wearing in a specific city or in a specific county, right? So there's a lot of discussion about that, and there's a lot of tension around that. It's a very real issue, right? We're all seeing that play out. In terms of cities empowerment in that discussion, we have seen cities who are actually requiring quarantine when you're coming in from other places. And that's certainly new. How you enforce that formally is very difficult if you don't have that agreement between states and cities. So it's a very real conversation.
Okay. Let's talk about the intersection between COVID and inequality. Something I think COVID has revealed in all of the starkness, divides that have been there for a long time, and that's something in many different societies. This notion of who gets to work from home and who doesn't, and who's doing fine through COVID and various forms of lockdown, who is not, who gets access to the healthcare, who does not. So certainly it's been revealed. And on the other hand, a lot of people are thinking about changes. They're thinking about this as a watershed moment in history when we don't have to go back to how things were necessarily. What is it going to take to translate that into reality?
It takes very thoughtful policy. There's no shortcut for that in terms of equality and in terms of making sure that people have access to services. This is a moment like no other. I think there are a few certainties in this. One is that access to digital infrastructure is no longer going to be seen as an optional right? This is going to be seen as a fundamentally important right for every citizen, right? If you don't have access to digital infrastructure, you can lose access to education. So in terms of how people are being given resources, right, public asset of digital infrastructure is going to be a conversation that has to come forward. So that's one piece that has to happen. And we've actually seen that, and I don't know if it's come through a lot in the news there as well, but in Hong Kong, when they went into lockdown earlier, they actually surveyed the vulnerable communities and the children who didn't have access to tablets or to devices that would enable them to do online learning. And some of the local foundations took it upon themselves to provide both the devices as well as the 5G. Now, that's kind of a step one, right, response. But in terms of recovery, then there has to be a rethink about what is the policy of providing access to education, right? Public schools will have to provide devices. Governments will have to provide access to internet at speeds that make it possible for kids to learn from home. And that's a very big conversation because it's not just about a device and access, right? It's also your learning environment. So that will take serious policy change and dialogue that is context specific. Also around affordability in housing. Again, these are not new issues. They're issues that COVID has exposed. And so, again, it comes back to what are we talking about when we're talking about poverty? Again, it's context specific. So in our cities who have very large slums, right? And we know that in the next 10 years, upwards of 20% of urban dwellers can be living in slums if there are not drastic changes made, then access to water and sanitation is a very big part of what needs to happen next. So there are a lot of issues there to unpack, Gabriel. That's a very big question. I'm happy to go into individual pieces of it if folks are interested.
Let's talk about the stress of sea level rise and the shock of major storm events. Because this week, there was a big storm off the coast of New South Wales, and there was a bunch of coastal erosion, and some very expensive properties are on the verge of falling into the sea. And it is raising the issue that we know is going to happen with increasing frequency in every coastal city in the world because of sea level rise, about how we either defend or how we retreat from the ocean. That emerges very often not as a technical question, but as a question about who pays.
Mm-hmm.
And so the stories this week are about, is it the responsibility of the people who own the homes to pay to protect themselves, or is it everybody's responsibility in the community? And I would say there's really no city I've ever seen where people gravitate to a managed retreat solution. People are attached to their homes if they live in them. People are attached to the cities. But there are lots of cities where people have accepted at this point a managed retreat solution because they've just been beaten down and forced to.
Yeah.
I would say that's a conversation that is in the very early stages here. So I know all kinds of cities in your network have been grappling with this. What are some of the best practices for thinking about that problem?
It's a great question, Gabriel. And I saw that in the registration, there are a number of folks from a lot of the engineering firms who do this for a living, actually, who do this kind of climate modeling and projection. And in terms of best practice, what we've seen are governments who make their climate models publicly accessible, and that information is actually downscaled, with a reasonable confidence level to the neighborhood scale, so that when you're a property owner, you are aware of your risk, and you have to acknowledge that risk, and then you have to take on insurance for that risk when you buy coastal property or when you buy property that is vulnerable to these kind of climate related shock events that we know will become more intense, are already becoming more and more intense as time goes on. So in terms of best practices, that's what we see is, governments making that data available, working with neighborhoods, working with developers to make that information known to those who are buying it. And then, the insurance markets will actually help to determine some of that risk appetite, right? It's not something that you can that you can fully solve for in terms of telling people where to or where not to invest, but you can certainly signal what the appetite is for the public sector and the private sector to take on that risk by making that information available, and directly connecting it to the properties that you develop, to zoning, and to insurance.
Okay. Will we see, I'm going to read this one because this is, as you will hear, this is not my viewpoint, but it's a question that a lot of people have. So I think this is an important one. Will we see a movement away from densifying cities toward more spread out models in response to COVID? And if so, how could we make this a sustainable and resilient approach to city planning?
I'm very bullish on cities, not because I work for a city network, but because of the bigger issues that we've just been talking about in terms of climate change, and because of economics. Cities are going to remain places of opportunity, places of diversity, places of arts and culture. So people will continue to want to be in cities. I think that's going to look very different in terms of spatial planning. So I think the second part of that question is incredibly interesting. I think that we have enormous assets in central business districts. Sydney is no exception. And I think that there's going to be immense opportunity for creativity in rezoning and the creation of interactive public spaces, because we have all just experienced a common trauma. I think now, if any of us were asked to go into a crowded subway train or a crowded, Times Square, or, a crowded opera house, right, we would probably shrink back from that. That would be our initial reaction. Whereas 6 months ago, we would have probably jumped at the chance to go to one of those places. Maybe not the crowded subway car, but probably the other two. So I think there's going to be an incredible opportunity to redesign public space. The second thing is, I think there's going to be an incredible opportunity to strengthen neighborhoods. And so I think this is a place where we've actually seen a number of our cities getting really active in terms of thinking about the new normal. So what are the characteristics of particular neighborhoods that they want to retain and strengthen as they emerge from COVID-19? What are the local businesses? What are the cultural, shall I say? What are kind of the cultural highlights of that neighborhood? And how do we strengthen them and ensure that if they are supported or if they are driven by small and medium enterprise, we target those enterprises for our relief? How do we ensure that we have the right kinds of transport to support neighborhoods and having people in their neighborhoods? A lot has been talked about in terms of the idea of the 15-minute city. Certainly living in Singapore, we have a lot of the aspects of this in our neighborhoods, in which, most neighborhoods you can within 15 minutes walk or take a bus to, the school, the shop, any kind of the services that you need. And a lot has been talked about in terms of cities like Paris committing to make this possible. And I think we're going to see a lot more of that in our cities. And in emerging markets, we're not going to see people turning away from cities, because the reality is that there are a lot of stresses from climate on current agricultural systems. And so there are still very clear trends that people are migrating to cities. And those cities will need a lot of support to build the adequate infrastructure to receive those populations.
Okay. I'll read this one. We're planning post-COVID resilience and recovery for our vulnerable community and resilience plan implementation phase. My question is, do you have any examples of how you can really connect with these marginalized and vulnerable communities in COVID times, when many of these people are not digitally mobile to engage for recovery and vulnerability information?
Sure, and I see the question. It also touches on Hong Kong. So what Hong Kong did, that was through a foundation. They made devices available to those vulnerable populations, and that was a choice that they made in order to engage them in education specifically. But in terms of engaging non-digitally mobile populations, this is an area where there's a lot of really great resources out there. We did a speaker series on informality, and in the context of that session, some of our presenters talked about community radio, which is, you know, an old an old solution to a new problem. We talked about community mapping and safe, socially distanced community meetings. So none of this is new, and in fact, a lot of it is immensely empowering for those communities to be involved in the process.
Okay. Are there examples where governments have adopted a climate risk exposure framework similar to that of the corporates for planning decisions?
Yes. Is there? Yeah, absolutely.
Any examples off the top of your head you can share?
Sure. I mean, whether it's here in Singapore or whether you look in New York, we were just talking, Gabriel, about your coastal example. Post Hurricane Sandy, New York required that you post the maps of your city's flood risk in the elevator shaft entryway of every building, which is an extension of a much broader and holistic framework for dealing with the climate challenge. We're seeing a lot of we're seeing a lot of that also in countries here in Southeast Asia. Most of them have a required mitigation framework that corresponds to their commitments to the UNFCCC in terms of their mitigation plan. And a lot of that rolls down both to the state level and then to major cities. So we see that both in terms of climate change adaptation and mitigation in places like Vietnam, in Thailand, certainly in the context of our European cities, who are all looking at creating green recovery in order to be eligible for stimulus. So it's very widespread practice.
Okay. Lauren, maybe I'll just ask you to maybe share some closing thoughts of, I guess a little bit your advice for Sydney in this really deeply scary and unsettled, but also very hopeful moment we're in. What do you think we should really be thinking about and prioritizing?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it goes back to my statement at the beginning. You know, you can't build on broken. You have to build back better. And in this case, Sydney needs to trust her training. And Sydney has a robust resilience process. Sydney has a robust resilience strategy. And as part of that, there are communication mechanisms for disaster response and recovery. There is very strong directional initiatives around community engagement and around public-private sector partnership in particular. And so I think this is an opportunity to accelerate that. Don't reinvent it. Do not start with a blank page, and really get serious about looking at the combination of communicable disease, equity, and climate.
Okay. Communicable disease, equity, and climate. Maybe the big three for us, or who knows? There's a lot to worry about, isn't there? Lauren, thank you so much for taking time. I know you have a whole world that you have to make resilient. It's
a pleasure, Gabriel. Thanks for having me.
Really appreciate you sharing your thoughts. if you will allow us to, we'll share your slides with the audience and put them up on our website, as we normally do. Everybody else, thank you for joining today's edition of Committee for Sydney Live, and we'll look forward to seeing you at the next one.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, bye.
Bye-bye.